Oceanic Pokemon are always going to be tricky. There are the ones that are so big that they aren't able to be kept outside of tanks the size of sports fields, if not larger, which no regular person is going to have any chance of having. Or their habitat and diet requirements are so specific and difficult to reach and maintain in a tank that it's unreasonable for the average person to be expected to keep them. And then there are those that are so strong that to keep them in anything less than a highly regulated and monitored enclosure means risking disaster. And unfortunately, I feel like we might be running into all three of those restrictions with this line. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and keep different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the very unique looking Pokemon Horsea and its evolutions Seadra and Kingdra. Horsea is a very different looking water Pokemon when you compare it to the rest of the aquatic world. This Pokemon's body stands upright, almost like we do, with a large curled tail at the bottom of its body and a small butterfly-like fin on its back that it uses for swimming. The belly is also covered in cream-colored ridges. Its head is round, with two sets of blue spiked fins on either side of its face and a long tube-like mouth. To cap it off, it has large eyes that have red irises. In total, it looks very much like a soft and friendly Pokemon. Horsea is also relatively small, only being about 1 foot 4 inches on average, or 0.4 meters, and only weighing about 17.5 pounds, that being 8 kilograms. This all changes though when the Pokemon evolves into a Seadra. A lot of the Pokemon scales go from smooth and round to sharp and spiky. The tail gets a lot longer, though it's still curled up under the Pokemon. Instead of the one single butterfly fin on its back, it has been replaced with two larger spiked fins that the Pokemon can use to pretty effectively push its way through the water. Then, its head is topped with sharp crests. Seadra is also much bigger than its previous evolution, standing nearly 4 feet tall and around 55 pounds. Or that's 1.2 meters and 25 kilos. And for the longest time, that's where the evolutionary line was thought to end. But with the advent of the trading machine and the discovery of the item known as a dragon scale, it was discovered that Seadra could evolve once again into the very powerful Kingdra. Kingdra is another massive increase in size when compared to its previous forms, now being nearly 6 feet tall on average, 1.8 meters, and weighing an impressive 335 pounds or 152 kilos. Kingdra keeps the same general body shape as the others in its evolutionary line, but trades a lot of Seadra's sharp edges for flowing lines. Its snout is now much more streamlined and powerful, and now has what almost seem like antlers and coral branches coming from the top of its head. As well, the spiked fins that Seadra had has now gone back down to a single fin, made of a thin white membrane and supported by more antler coral-like branches. In reality, these are not too complex of a Pokemon line, but we all know by now that caring for water-type Pokemon, especially the fully aquatic ones, can get pretty tough and have a lot of factors to keep an eye on. If that's not a deterrent to you, well, let's get into the guide and figure out if these Pokemon could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. So, there's two special things that you have to think about when it comes to these Pokemon. One is that they are very social, to the point where you should have at least 2 of these Pokemon in your enclosure, or they might start experiencing things like depression, anxiety, and loneliness. This holds true for at least Horsea and Seadra. Kingdra, like we'll cover in the care section of this guide, has extenuating circumstances that mean they aren't as social as their pre-evolutions. But for the first 2 forms, they will need at least another of their own kind in there with them. To that end, I'll make sure that the enclosure dimensions that I give you are at least big enough to handle 2 of these Pokemon, and if you want to add more to your what is a group of these Pokemon called? Hold on, everyone. A shoal. Huh. That's actually a pretty cool name. But if you want to increase the size of your shoal, then you'll have to expand the tank beyond that. Also, I feel I should mention this to you, if you get opposite sex members of this species, meaning a male and female, they're most likely going to reproduce. If you don't want that, then be sure to get 2 Pokemon of the same sex. The second major issue that you're going to encounter with these Pokemon, as you will with most oceanic Pokemon, is going to be the enclosure size. Oh, sure, Horsea is going to be a reasonable sized tank, but it's also the smallest of the group. For a pair of Horsea, you'll want something that is at least 55 gallons in volume, though larger is never a bad thing for these Pokemon. You want to make sure that the tank is on the taller size, with the height of the tank being at least twice the height of the Pokemon, giving them plenty of space to swim and move around. Then, for each Horsea that you add above the initial 2, you should add in another 10 gallons to the enclosure. That's honestly a fairly reasonable sized enclosure. You could easily have this tank set up on a table in your home and could easily take care of them with little issue. It's once we start working our way up the evolutionary chain that things get more unmanageable. When your Pokemon evolve into a Seadra, not only are they now 3 times the size of your Horsea, but Seadra are also a lot more energetic than Horsea. With the larger fins and the fact that they now have 2 of them as opposed to 1, they can swim and move much faster and with more force than any Horsea ever can. All this means that you're looking at a tank that measures into thousands of gallons, easily the size of your average above ground pool. There's really no way that you're going to be able to just buy these from your local pet store like you could with the Horsea's enclosure. As well, it needs to be at least 10 feet deep to accommodate your Seadras, which is actually deeper than most above ground pools you can get. That's gonna have to be a custom build no matter what you do. And then we get to Kingdra. Kingdra is actually the first Dragon-type Pokemon that we're covering in this show, and as we go on, you'll see a trend with Dragon-type Pokemon is that they are exceedingly powerful creatures. There's a reason that the majority of super strong Pokemon that people place in the unofficial pseudo-legendary category are Dragon types, and even the ones that avoid this label are well known to be on the stronger end. That kind of power can often lead to some quirks in their care and enclosure. For Kingdra, it means that they not only need a lot of space in their tanks, they also need a tank that is much deeper than either of their pre-evolutions. I'm talking about a tank that, and this is the minimum size, mind you, is at least the length and width of a Unovan football field, and it has to have a depth exceeding 35 feet deep. That's about 110 meters long, 49 meters wide, and 11 meters deep for the majority of the world that has no concept of how big a Unovan football field is. I don't know about you, but to me, that is an insane size for an enclosure. All because this Pokemon is so powerful that if you try to house it in anything smaller than that, it's most likely gonna break the enclosure on top of not being happy or healthy. And to top it all off, the enclosure needs to be able to handle things like whirlpools, water spouts, and strong currents. Again, thanks to how strong these Pokemon are. Right away, I'm going to tell you that this is the kind of enclosure that needs to be specifically built to exacting specifications by professional companies and will need to be inspected at a few different stages of the construction. It is a massive undertaking, and is the main reason that the only times you see professional trainers with these kind of Pokemon on their teams are gym leaders and Pokemon League members. They're really the only ones that have the resources to house these Pokemon outside of a Pokeball. It's not only the enclosure that takes a lot of setup, you also have to keep an eye on the conditions of the water. Things like temperature, salinity, pH balance, and the lighting are all things that you're going to have to deal with when caring for these Pokemon. The temperature is actually the easiest to handle. As their availability locations will show later on, these Pokemon can live in locations that have wildly varying water temps, from the colder waters of Kanto and Sinnoh to the warmer waters of Alola and Hoenn. Really, the main things that you have to keep an eye on are the pH and the salinity. For the pH, it needs to be around 8.1 to 8.4, which is a bit more on the basic side of the scale, and the salinity has to be around 28 to 32 parts per thousand. Or, if the test you're using uses the specific gravity of the water, then you'll be aiming for between 1.021 and 1.025. I know, that's a lot of chemistry and science stuff that I just threw at you, but if you're looking at getting some of these Pokemon, then you'll need to learn about them. Aside from all that, you need to make sure that the enclosures have a few things. Of course, with this being an oceanic line, you'll need to make sure that you fill the tank with salt water. Make sure that you get all the equipment that is rated to handle the salt that's going to be flowing through it. Always remember, salt eats away at anything it comes into contact with, especially metal. For all of these Pokemon, a decent current is needed for them as well. This helps with circulating fresh, oxygenated water to these Pokemon and around the tank. A current like that can be gotten if you have a decent, strong filter on the tank, which will also help with keeping the waters clean. Of course, as the tank gets bigger, the filter and current systems are going to get increasingly more complex. For Horsea, you'll probably just need a small motor, like the regular ones that you can get for most indoor fish tanks. Seadra might need a couple of motors, or just one big one that can handle that level of water, and of course, for Kingdra, it's going to be an entire complex system of motors that can keep that much water moving. Mind, you have to be careful that you don't make the current too strong in the Horsea enclosure. Seadra and Kingdra won't be too affected by this since they're fairly strong swimmers, but Horsea is actually a weak swimmer and can be pushed around if the current is too strong. On top of that, you should have some decorations in the tank with your Pokemon. I would recommend a small layer of sand, about 1.5 inches worth, with things like rocks, coral branches, and plants all set into it. This is important as these Pokemon sleep by wrapping their tails around those things to anchor them to the bottom of the seafloor, or in this case, the bottom of the tank. Especially Kingdra, who won't just need some rocks or coral, they'll actually need a spot where they can feel secluded from the rest of the tank for their hibernation. To that end, you'll also have to have a cave installed on the bed of your tank where your Kingdra can enter to sleep without having too much interruptions to their natural rhythm. It's not much when you compare it to the rest of the tank, but it's all very important to these Pokemon. As for Pokemon that can be housed with your Horsea evolution, of course you're going to be limited by a few factors. One is that this line is carnivorous, and they will eat anything that they can catch and fit into their mouths. That includes small fish, crustaceans that they're able to crack the shell on, and the occasional shellfish. On top of that, each of the lines has a special factor that makes keeping anything else with them complicated. Horsea are not great swimmers, as I've said, and are generally very timid Pokemon, so if you put them with anything too aggressive in an enclosure, then you're asking for your Horsea to be hurt. Seadra, while being more able to defend itself from threats, does so through the use of toxins that it puts out through the spines on its body. Any Pokemon that you put with them, other than other Horsea evolutions, might end up needing a run to the Pokemon Center due to toxins. Kingdra might seem like the best bet to house other Pokemon with at first glance. It has a massive tank, and the Kingdra itself spends the majority of its time hibernating in the cave at the bottom of its tank. But when your Kingdra does wake up, not only is it then going to go on a hunting spree trying to fill its belly for the next hibernation cycle, it's also going to disturb the entire environment of the enclosure just through waking up, thanks to the strong whirlpools and water spouts that are going to start happening from your Kingdra releasing its stored up energy. That is a serious risk to any Pokemon that you have in the tank with them, meaning that it's really best to leave it in the tank alone. Same, honestly, with the rest of the evolutionary line, But let me remind you that Horsea and Seadra both need at least one other of their own kind around, as the first two stages of the line are very social. You should be ready to accommodate that need and possibly get a bigger enclosure if you plan to go over the two individual limits that I've covered here in this guide. Availability. The nice part about this line is that they are very easy to find in the wild. Horsea and Seadra are super abundant. They're available in most of the ocean-facing routes in Kanto, the southern routes surrounding Pacific Town and Hoenn, routes 17 and 18 in southern Unova. Even in the regions where they aren't super abundant, there are still places where they can be found with very little effort. They like to make their homes in the Whirl Islands in Choto and near Stark Mountain in Sinnoh, along Route 226, the Insular Sea in Galar along the Isle of Armor, Kala'e Bay in Alola, and then Ambret Town and Silage City in Kalos. It's honestly amazing that they haven't spread farther than those spots, but it might be a matter of shallower waters versus deeper waters. Speaking of which, due to Kingdra being classified as a trade evolution, it's very rare for them to show up in the wild. You would need a Seadra to be near an item known as a dragon scale, and then receive an electric shock of very specific voltage to trigger the evolution. As I'm sure you can imagine, that's not exactly something that happens every day. On top of that scarcity, Kingdra spend the majority of their time hibernating at the bottom of the ocean, conserving and building their energy for the brief periods of activity when they're awake. Being on the bottom of the ocean and non-responsive to most stimuli means that finding them like that is astoundingly difficult. And then, when they do wake up, they trigger storms, bad waves, and powerful currents, meaning that finding them might become easier, but it also becomes way more dangerous, which is probably worse. All that being said, finding a wild Kingdra is going to be an exercise in frustration, patience, and defying death. Which I'm sure means that you're hoping that they're more available in the breeding industry. I hate to burst your bubble on that, but no, they aren't. Having to build such a big enclosure for just one Kingdra is a massive undertaking and investment. Not to mention that there is next to no market for selling that Pokemon to casual trainers. Having to make an enclosure that's large enough for more than one of them, well, let's just say that whatever breeder decides they're going to invest in a Kingdra breeding program has way too much money, space, and time on their hands. Thankfully, the market for the previous two evolutions is much better. Setting up a breeding facility for Horseas is relatively easy thanks to how manageable their enclosure is, as well as how social they can be. The same goes for Seadra, though they'll be a bit harder to get a hold of simply due to the fact that their size and the fact that they're slightly venomous. If you want one of the first two evolutions, then it shouldn't be too hard for you to find a breeder that's selling them, and if you decide you really want a Kingdra, then you can probably get the breeder to help you evolve a Seadra when you buy them. Just be sure to remember that you'll be paying more for that service because the breeder will have to get the dragon scale for the Seadra to hold on to during the trade. Catchability. As with most Pokemon that you have to either fish up or randomly encounter on the open sea, the biggest thing that you'll need to encounter these Pokemon is patience and a way to defend yourself. Thankfully, Horsea and, to a lesser extent, Seadra aren't the most difficult Pokemon to try and fish for. They're abundant enough in the areas they live in that if you use the correct kind of bait and a decent rod, you shouldn't have to cast out more than a handful of times to hook one of these Pokemon. Just remember that you aren't guaranteed to bring up what you're looking for from the depths, and you had better be able and willing to defend yourself from any and all kinds of Pokemon that might appear. Always research what types of Pokemon are present in the area you're hunting in, and prepare accordingly. As for dealing with a Horsea evolution, your best bets are having either an electric or grass-type Pokemon on hand. Kingdra, as ever, is a much different beast. Not only is it very rare to encounter a Kingdra in the wild, you also have to hope that it's even awake at the time that you're hunting for it. And if it is awake, then you're looking at dealing with all kinds of massive environmental issues. Storms, massive waves, whirlpools, water spouts, strong currents. Being out there in that is going to feel like the end of the world and is my personal nightmare scenario. I really cannot stress how not worth it is to try and go out and catch one of these Pokemon. You're going to be putting yourself in major danger. But I have to say that it is at least possible. You'll need a massive ship that can handle that kind of rough sailing, along with a crew that's very experienced in dealing with bad weather conditions, as well as the strongest defense Pokemon that you can get your hands on, but it is technically possible. As for what you should be using to catch each Pokemon, a Pokeball or Great Ball should be fine for Horsea, a Great Ball should be good for Seadra, and certainly use an Ultra Ball for Kingdra if you even get the chance to throw one at them. Care. After all that, the care for these Pokemon really comes down to two different things that you have to do: feeding and cleaning. Let's start with the latter. As with any enclosure that has water as a major part of the enclosure, there are a lot of factors you'll have to keep an eye on. You should check the temperatures every day, as that's one of the factors that can change the most rapidly. The other factors, like the pH and the salinity levels, should be checked at least weekly, more if they've been out of balance recently. The tests to check them should be easily accessible online and come with instructions on how to properly use them. You'll also have to do frequent water changes for the enclosure. This not only will help to keep the majority of the water clean in the enclosure, but it will also make it much easier for you to maintain the needed levels for the enclosure water. If there is nothing wrong with the water, like you haven't noticed any of the levels are out of whack, then you should be replacing about 20% of the water every 3 to 4 weeks. If you have noticed a problem with either the salinity or the pH, then you should start to change the water out more frequently, about every week and a half as long as the issue isn't major. This slow change out of water will not only keep your Pokemon from possibly going into shock from being rapidly introduced to new levels in the water, but it also helps to keep some of the more healthy bacteria that could develop in your Horsea's evolution's environment. Of course, this changing out of water is going to be much harder to handle for the large evolutions than it's going to be for a Horsea, but it's still a necessary part of their care. Speaking of, there's also the needed cleaning that you'll have to do of the glass and the filter systems. Over time, they are going to get gross, just due to the nature of always being submerged in water and dealing with the salt. And as I said with the water, the effort needed for this is going to massively change based on what evolution you have. For example, the glass in the Horsea and Seadra enclosures can be cleaned with one of those magnetic scrubbers that you can get stuck on the edge of the tank, and the filters can just be pulled out of the filter systems and cleaned that way. Or, if you don't like how long and physically intensive scrubbing the walls of your Seadra's enclosure is going to be, you can also try to get one of those scrubbing vacuums that people get for the walls of their pools. In my personal opinion, your best bet for getting this done is to either hire someone or get suited up yourself in diving gear and use the scrubbing vacuum on the walls. You can always put your Seadra into their Pokeballs if you don't feel comfortable swimming around with them, which I don't blame you for since their spines are venomous. And as for the large and complex water filter and current system that you have to get for your Kingdra, you're probably going to have someone come out and clean it for you. I can't imagine that something that large and complex is going to have a simple filter that you can just pull out and hose off. Always remember that you want to use Pokemon safe chemicals when you clean the tank, especially as whatever you use will be released into the surrounding water and will easily come into contact with your Pokemon. Feeding is a somewhat easier and less complex affair than cleaning is. This line is carnivorous, often feeding on small crustaceans and fish. To that end, you have a few options when it comes to how you feed these Pokemon. One is that you can just release the food into the water of the enclosure. This is the easiest method, very much a throw and walk away method, but the issues kind of outweigh the convenience of it. If your Pokemon doesn't eat up every bit of food you throw in, then it can end up starting to decay and rot at the bottom or the top of the tank, which is going to start making the water gross, and if left for too long, can also lead to disease taking hold in the tank. You'll have to get into the tank to remove the food that doesn't get eaten. Lastly, it's also just a waste of money for food to go bad. On the other end of the spectrum, you could try hand feeding. This is really good if you end up getting one of the picky eaters that doesn't like to eat anything but live food. By putting the food in your hand, it allows you to move it around through the water, giving the illusion that it's still alive and kicking. It might not work, and if you can't get them to eat from your hand after about 15 minutes, then you'll have to go to live food, which I know plenty of you don't feel comfortable with. Also, hand feeding is really only something you can do with Horsea. Seadra, well, they wouldn't hurt you on purpose if they're used to you, but with their venomous spines, it's a real possibility that they may just accidentally graze you with one, and then you have to take an emergency trip to the hospital. Kingdra, though, when you feed them, it's a much more hazardous endeavor. With the thrashing waters, the power this Pokemon has, and the fact that they wake up ravenous, it's very dangerous to be sticking your whole hand into reach of this Pokemon's mouth. The only saving grace in that situation is that they don't have teeth, but it's still gonna suck. Now, if you aren't dealing with one of the picky eaters, then the best thing you can do is to get a feeding station. These are small boxes that can be attached to the side of your enclosure where you can place the food, and then your Pokemon can swim up and either enter the station to get the food, or they can stick their head in to eat what you give them. To me, this seems like the best option, as it keeps the food in one spot so you don't have to clean the entire tank just to get that one piece of food your Pokemon didn't eat, and it'll teach your Pokemon to always expect food to come from the same spot every time. Consistency is always a good thing when you're trying to establish a Pokemon in captivity. And these can work for all three of the evolutions. You'll just have to get larger ones for the later evolutions so that they can get to the food inside. When it comes to the amount of food that these Pokemon should be getting, you'll be feeding the first two evolutions 3 times a day with smaller meals. Due to the tube shape of their mouth, you'll have to feed them things that fit inside that tube, either from Pokemon that are naturally shaped like that, such as Tatsugiri, Wishiwashi, or the main bodies of Clauncher and Corphish, or taking the meat and cutting them into strips, at which point you can really use the meat of any prey-sea Pokemon. Exact numbers for these Pokemon are hard to narrow down, but it seems that the average Horsea will eat about 1.5 pounds of food a day, and a Seadra will eat about 3 pounds of food a day. Like I said, split between 3 meals over the course of a day. But when it comes to Kingdra, things change drastically. As I've said multiple times over the course of this guide, Kingdra enter extended periods of hibernation. This is due to their new draconic nature. Over time, as they sleep, they build up their power until it reaches a crescendo, at which point they awaken and go on a flurry of activity, spending all of this power until they eventually need to re-enter hibernation and start the cycle over again. This release of strong, draconic power is what causes all the storms and environmental issues when a Kingdra is active. Normally, these hibernation cycles can last anywhere from 1 to 3 months, followed by an awake period of 4 to 7 days. And, as I'm sure you can imagine, it also plays into their eating schedule. Of course, these Pokemon won't be eating anything while they're hibernating, so that actually makes the majority of their care much easier than most Pokemon. But you should regularly keep an eye on the enclosure so that you can be ready to start feeding when you see that your Pokemon is going to be waking up soon. You'll begin seeing things like small whirls appearing in the water, stronger currents showing up than what your filter system should be producing, and, rarely, there can also be a slight glowing coming from where your Pokemon is resting. When all of that begins, it means that you have to start getting ready to do a lot of feeding. An awake and active Kingdra is going to eat an astonishing 6 pounds of food a day, still divided between 3 meals over the course of the day. The feeding station should still be effective so long as you train them on that from before they were a Kingdra. Otherwise, you'll just have to use the free feeding method. Hand feeding a Kingdra? like I said, is not a good idea. Just something to keep an eye on when you feed Kingdra. If your Kingdra is already awake, then the water is going to be turbulent and probably moving quickly. Be careful when you put the food into the feeding station, or you could easily fall into the water and then you have to deal with a very dangerous situation. Cost. I'm gonna level with you. Most, if not all of the things in this guide are going to be on a sliding scale from cheap to really expensive based on what evolution you decide to have. For example, when we talk about how expensive the Pokemon itself is going to be, Horsea isn't going to be that much thanks to its ease of raising and the simplicity of its enclosure, probably maxing out in the low category. Seadra will be a bit of a jump up to the moderate or possibly the lower end of the high category. And Kingdra, because of the ridiculous size of its enclosure and the item needed to have one, is certainly going to be in the very high category if you can even find someone who sells Kingdra as opposed to stopping at Seadra. Same pattern with the enclosures. Horsea's is so small that you can probably get most of the stuff for their tank from your average pet store, which means that it won't go above the low category. Seadra, you're going to have to order them online from a specific supplier or have them custom built, bringing it to the high category. And then, following suit, the massive tank that you'll need for Kingdra is going to be very, very far into the very high category. Food is the one spot where this pattern doesn't hold purely because of Kingdra's hibernation. Horsea and Seadra are going to be in the moderate and the high category respectively. Seafood is often expensive to get a hold of after all, but thanks to the fact that you won't have to feed Kingdra anything for 1 to 3 months, actually brings the price down from what it could have been, even if it's still in the high category thanks to how much they eat in that short amount of time they're awake. The nice part is that you can freeze the food so that you have it on hand when you need it. Just be sure to fully thaw it out when you go to feed it to your Pokemon. Conclusion. Whew. That definitely feels like my longest guide so far. I knew dragon types would make things more complex, but I don't think there's been a Pokemon line that has varied so wildly with how good of a pet Pokemon they would make as this line does. Realistically, Horsea is a great beginner Pokemon for those out there that want to have a saltwater aquatic Pokemon. It's got a decent sized enclosure, you can interact with them by hand feeding, something that you can't say for a lot of aquatic Pokemon, and they're friendly and cute. And then, when they evolve into a Seadra, they get a bit more complicated with the larger fins and the venomous spines. Definitely something that should be considered an intermediate level Pokemon. And then there's Kingdra. I really can't see this being something that can be kept outside of an aquarium. Unless you have a metric ton of money, that is, because just the tank itself is going to be a major project to get completed. Not to mention that it can be dangerous just to feed this Pokemon when they're awake due to what they do to the water. So when talking about this line, it really matters which form you're talking about when you consider if these Pokemon would be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the vibrantly colored Pokemon Goldeen and its evolution Sea King. Have a wonderful night, everyone.